Hey guys, welcome to week 5. This week you will be working on visualizations, which are an important part of any report, and I'll go over that briefly. Briefly as we continue on. So you, at the time of viewing this, you will have submitted your progress reports. Hopefully those went well. I know I saw a few of the drafts, and from what I could tell, you guys really understood what the concept of a progress report was, which is you're kind of in between the research and you've done some things, but you still have things to do, and you need to convince me that you are capable of doing those things. So now that you are past the progress report, you can kind of see the finish line now of the final report, the final recommendation report that I'll be going to in more depth for week 6. But this week, I wanted to devote a separate week to just the visualizations part because they're an underrated and I think underutilized aspect of communication in terms of technical reports that I wanted you to read a chapter on and then to actually do a bit more in-depth thinking about. So that's why this week there's 2 things you have to do. There's less writing than you normally would, of course, because we are dealing with visualizations, but there are 2 things that you guys need to do this week, and that's under the assignment visualizations. There's part 1 and there's part 2. The part 1 is a graphics case. So under the cases tab in Blackboard, there's another case there, not case 1, 2, or 3, but it's a separate case just for this week. It's a graphics case, and what it is, it's a workplace-based scenario, a hypothetical scenario that you need to imagine yourself in. So it talks about as if you were at this workplace and these R&D scientists need to communicate data at a conference on car accidents. And they've created these 3 visuals in the case. And the case gets more into detail in this, but they created 3 visuals. But there are some elements that are erroneous about the visuals. They made some mistakes in terms of executing what effective visualization is. And after reading chapter 12, so read chapter 12 first, and then when you look at the visuals, if you look closely, you'll see that each visual makes a mistake or makes a misstep in either in design choices, in text used, in the type of graph used, whatever it is. They all make small mistakes that kind of go unnoticed, and because the visuals don't strike you as poor visuals right off the top, but when you actually start to ask questions like, well, what does this mean? What are they trying to portray? You start to see that they could be done better. So at the end of that scenario, it goes in and it essentially asks you to create a guide that could help people create better visuals. And I'm leaving that with little parameters because I'm trying to simulate this workplace experience where you need to fill a gap, you need to contribute something. They ask you, oh, there's a communication specialist. Why don't you, or clearly our employees, your managers say clearly our employees aren't really thinking about visuals that well. Why don't you step in and create just a brief 1-page thing that can help guide us so that when we go to conferences, we could do a better job, right? So that's the kind of role I'm positioning you in. And that's essentially all the guidelines I'm giving you. Now, there's about 4 or 5 bullets at the end of the case that kind of indicate things that you should do. I mean, it is only 1 page. You should be creative. It should be informed by the textbook. Like, there are certain things that I'm expecting. But in terms of what it looks like, just treat it like a blank slate. It's your however you want to approach creating a guide about how to create effective visuals. Is completely up to you. So read the case for more details, and if you have any questions, do let me know. So that's part 1. Part 2 is you actually taking the data that you have from your SurveyMonkey research and creating 3 visuals on it this week. So before you submit the final report, I want you to think of the visuals that you'll be including in the report, because visuals are a required component of the report. So I'm having you create 3 visuals so that I can see them and I can give you feedback on whether or not they should be included in the final report. So you're taking the data you have, most likely your quantitative data, from those 5 questions, and you are creating visualizations based upon that information. So whether it's numbers, a certain percentage think this, or however you want to visualize the data you have. Follow the textbook in terms of which visual you should choose for the data being presented. So for example, pie charts are good for showing parts of a whole, right? Like percentages of things. Line graphs are effective for showing progress over time, and bar graphs are used for showing comparison, or so there's this entire table in the textbook that goes over which one you should choose. So choose wisely, because I'm going to be grading you on the appropriateness of the visual type that you chose. So if you choose a pie chart for something where it's not percentages or parts of a whole, then that's a poor choice. So there's the actual practical part of it, but then there's also what I'll also be looking at is, are you choosing the right information to present? So that leads us to the question, what kind of things need to be visualized in a technical report, right? There's this thing called chart junk, where there's unnecessary visuals. It's referenced in the case. Sometimes it's just added colors or making it 3D when it doesn't need to be three-dimensional, or whatever it is. And chart junk also extends to including visuals just for visual's sake, and you want to avoid that. Anything that's simple enough to be communicated in a sentence and doesn't really need to be visualized shouldn't be included. So for example, if I were to survey the class, and let's say there were still 20 of you, just for clean numbers, and I asked you, how many of you would prefer a multiple choice exam over a final report? And let's say 8 of you said, yes, I want a multiple choice exam. And I'm writing my report, or I'm communicating that to my department or whatever. I could simply write in the report, 8 out of 10 students would prefer multiple choice. I don't need to then create a bar graph or a pie chart communicating 8 out of 20, because that is a very straightforward number. And that visual doesn't really communicate the point in a more clear way, because saying 8 out of 20 is a pretty clear way. It's it's simple, it's rudimentary enough that it doesn't need to be visualized. So try and avoid just using visualizations to communicate basic data. So visualizations in technical reports typically are used when the information is complicated enough to be put in visual formats, so as to reinforce the idea with the reader, so that they read it in text. And they might not really get it, but then once they see it in visual form, then they'll have a better sense of it. You don't want to visualize something that is very straightforward. Another type of information you want to visualize in a report is information that's very, very significant. So, the main part of your report, this many students think one thing, if you're going with case 1, so with the name change, right? So if your report, or if your recommendation and your data is leading you to believe that most students do want a name change from interdisciplinary studies to Bachelor of English, or Bachelor of Science in English, if there's some very important data related to that point, you want to visualize that, because that is a core part of the report. It's you don't just want to visualize a question that necessarily wasn't as important to the overall argument of the report. So I hope that makes sense. So the two main types of information you want to visualize are either information that's too complex, or could be made more simple through visualizations, right? Visuals are not intended to make things more complicated. Usually visuals are meant to make things easier. This is why we see a lot of visual communication over the last 10 or 15 years, specifically in our online communication, where people are just fascinated by visuals, interactive visuals, because it's taking complex data sets that would be hundreds and hundreds of textual pages and putting it into a visualization, because it simplifies something, right? It allows us to interact with it better. It becomes more memorable. So in that capacity, your visuals should also follow that philosophy, that it should be trying to clarify something that's complicated, or to accentuate something that's extremely important. And those are generally the two criteria that you want to use when you're choosing visualizations. So you really only have one chapter this week to read, which is chapter 12, and it's all about creating graphics. So again, to reiterate part 1, you'll be critiquing some graphics. There are 3 graphics on there to kind of get you thinking about what are the good criteria of graphics, to see what poor graphics are, and reading the textbook alongside that, so that when you reach part 2, you'll be able to create your own graphics and abide by the principles that you've developed based upon your reading the chapter in your interaction with graphics that, while sufficient, aren't necessarily effective, and they could be made better. So what you'll notice is the visuals aren't wrong in that sense, but they could be made more clear. So as usual, email me if you have any questions, but all the instructions for the graphics case are at the end of the graphics case. Make sure you scroll all the way down. There are 2 separate drop boxes, so you don't have to combine the PDFs for those 2 things. In terms of creating your own graphics, you can either use Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel. I think your data is simple enough to use Microsoft Word, because you don't have sheets and tables of data, so you don't necessarily have to use Excel if you don't want, but it's all personal preference. So you do have to use one of those 2, or the Mac version of those, so Pages or Numbers. So let me know if you have any questions, but make sure you use those programs to create your visuals. If you don't know how, if you Google create graph in Microsoft Excel, you can certainly find out how to do that. So let me know if you have any questions. I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with.